Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to the second session of Raza Varta. It is our privilege to have Sri Udayan Vajpayee, renowned poet and essayist, with us this afternoon. As one of the esteemed speakers, Sri Vajpayee will be engaging in a conversation on the topic of abstraction in poetry with Ms. Jaisal Thakur, founder and director of Bodhana Arts and Research Foundation. May I request Mr. Vajpayee and Ms. Thakur to kindly take their seats on the stage, please. We look forward to a truly enlightening session ahead. I would not take any more time. Over to Ms. Thakur. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, I think the place is very enlightened physically. So now let's see how we can enlighten with words. So yesterday we had a very interesting panel discussion which focused on abstraction and the elements that led to the language of abstraction in Raza's paintings. Geeti Sen was presenting, I was presenting, Nana Ganguly was presenting, and we kind of, each one of us presented the various facets and aspects, of culture, philosophy, landscape, nature, that led to that language. The Later series or the Bindu series, which he's mainly known for. So I'm going to ask this question to Mr. Vajpayee, who is a poet, but he is equally well versed with art and particularly abstraction, because I've heard a lot of his conversations and we've had interactions. So the elements of abstract art in the visual language, you can define them as form, as color, as texture. So how would one define that in poetry? Like, what would the elements be? They're just words, technically. So very basic question, and then we can, of course, build on it. So if we can just begin with this.
Thank you very much. To start with, I'll say that, there are not those kind of particular elements in poetry that you can call that these are what constitute abstraction in, let's say, poem. In the tradition, there can be three. They have seen language can be used in three different ways. So one is that I use only the word, and the word is and in itself. In certain, texts, word is something in itself. The Vedas, for example. So in Vedic chanting, for that matter, is supposed to have only words. So it's called Shabda Kendrit, Shabdashrit. It's dependent only on the words. That means sound and intonations and all that which is connected with the word. Now there is another use of the word where meaning is of central importance, like a text of history, for example. So how is it written? It hardly matters, If you remember history written by, let's say, Kosambi, and if I ask you to repeat it, you'll repeat the meaning. You'll create new words. You will say that he wrote something like that, or he wrote this, and you will use new words for that meaning. So the meaning is the central, that is arthashrit. Now, in poetry, the situation is quite strange, that it is called ubhayashrit, that it is dependent on both. It's a word, and at the same time, it's meaning. Now, Kalidas uses a very nice metaphor to say this. He says, in the beginning of a text, he says, the way that Shiv and Parvati are inseparable, in the same way, Shabd, that word, and meaning, they are inseparable in a text. So what does it mean? It means that whenever you repeat a poem, you would repeat its words, you'll repeat its sound, you'll repeat its inherent music, but at the same time, you will also create a meaning. So therefore, when you come back to a word, to a poem, it will give new meaning, because it never stops. It's like word is in such a relationship with the meaning that word becomes the fountain of meaning, as if, right? Now, the relationship that a poet strikes between, a certain usage of the language is such that the word and the meaning, they both become equally significant, important in a poem. Now, I can say that you can use the word in a very concrete way, like in writing sociology or a news report or all that. The same word, the same element, if it's differently used, that becomes poetry. So therefore, what happens is that when we are talking about that the poem is word and the meaning together, which means that word never exhaust themselves in a poem, never exhaust themselves into certain meaning. Same happens in the painting also, that you go back to a painting, some new meaning will come, a new relationship will be made. You go back to a new bhav would come. That will come to, because meaning is a very, very ordinary thing, this is just a beginning.
Right. Like, I was just reading this essay and you, sorry. I was just reading this essay about delay and the name, some thoughts on abstraction in poetry. If you all get a chance to read this article, please do. And you begin the essay by, talking about the three powers in words,
Yes.
Which is Abhida, Lakshan, and Vyanjan. So can we just talk about that?
And this too is because, in a sense, poetry uses the word in such a way that it unleashes its power. So it reestablishes the power of the language, because language works at various levels. And I think in India, the kind of thinking that has gone into the idea of language is immense. In a sense, lots of other tradition of thinking, they followed it. But to start with your question, that Abhidha, when we say that, what is the meaning of Abhidha? What does it connote? So let's say when I say chair, and when I mean a chair, a form, that is Abhidha. That's the first meaning. But when I say chair, and I mean power, when you say that he has vacated the chair of Prime Minister, or something like that. So it does not mean that he stood, on that chair, he left the chair, etc. No, the chair there means a power. So this is an extended meaning. It's a meaning which has come out of the same word, but it's extended. Now, this is Lakshana. And third is Vyanjana. Now, the Vyanjana word has come from the kitchen. It has come from Vyanjan. In fact, lots of our words of Kavishastra have come from kitchen. For example, Rasa, it has come from kitchen. And Vyanjana, they are two most significant words, for poetry and Kavishastra. Now, the third is Vyanjana. Now, the example that's given, you can, once I'll give this example, then you can see that example elsewhere also. In Sanskrit, they use the sentence, it's called Gangayam Ghosha. Ghosha is ghar, is house. And Ganga is Ganga, the river. So, house in Ganges, Ganga me ghar. First meaning, Abhidha, is cancelled out, because there cannot be a house in the river. Right? So the first meaning gets cancelled. The second Lakshana, Ganga Yam Ghosha, extended meaning is that the house is so close to Ganges that it is as if inside Ganga. Right? Now, in third meaning, that is Vyanjana, the meaning frees itself from this locale. So there is neither this Ganga nor its beach, nor its bank. So Gangayam Ghosha means any house which is inside, which has a cool inside and some sacred feeling That is Gangayam. So that too means that. So that's a Vyanjana. That's the third meaning.
So these are forms of abstraction.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Uh,
So you are moving away from the concrete reality into a reality which is uncertain, which is born out of your relationship with that word and also your own experiences.
right.
So then at that point, the word becomes a suggestion.
Right. So, could
Yeah.
you recite a poem that has this, your poem, or since this is about poetry, let's bring in some poetry.
I'll come to that if I
Okay.
just remember that. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So, these are the basic elements, which is the word,
Yes,
right? But then
yes.
when you're composing a poem, when you're writing, there is an element of rhythm, there is an element of
Yes.
word composition, there
Yes.
is an element of the space and the pauses, right? So, and space, when we talk about space, space again is so important in a pictorial abstraction.
Yes.
So, how could we define that in poetry?
Now, the first thing that you spoke of, that's rhythm, which means time. Rhythm in a poetry would mean in a certain kind of temporality. I somehow feel that, and this is not only true with poetry, it is also true with great prose, like Dostoevsky or, because all great prose is poetry, in one way or the other. Now, I feel that every one of us is born with a certain inherent rhythm, a certain inherent, which is swabhav, which is inner disposition, but that also is a certain kind of rhythm that everyone is born with. And now, a poet somehow becomes very self-conscious, so he's searching for that rhythm when she's writing. So this is, and when I say a rhythm, does not mean one rhythm, it's a composite rhythm. But it has links with each other, So it's a certain kind of composition, certain kind of composite rhythm that everyone is born with. And therefore you will see that different poets, even though they may be writing in prose, they may be writing in free verse, there'll be different ways of reading those poems. If you read even a out-and-out prose poem, most that I write, in fact, if you do not read those poems in a certain rhythm, which are inherent in those sentences, or in that relationship of sentences, or in the relationship of words, that poem will not be uttered properly. You will feel that you are incorrectly reading it, even though you might be pronouncing the words absolutely correctly. But the pauses between the sentences, and a reader finally has to find that, because a reader will have to discover her own rhythm when she is reading a particular poem, with a certain inherent rhythm. Whatever you end up writing, because, if there is Vyanjana in a poem, and Anand Vardhan, yes, Anand Vardhan says in 10th century, 10th, 12th century, 10th, he says that a poem which does not have this third meaning or Vyanjana, third meaning is Roland Barthes said that. So, that which does not have a third meaning is an ordinary poem. I mean, he doesn't call it a poem also. He calls it dhvani. And dhvani means suggestion, which is through Vyanjana that, that you enter into that uncertain area, and area of, let's say, your emotional world, and experience something. That experience is also, that whole area is also abstract. It's not well made. And on that actually is the, theory of rasa is based. Because if you don't enter into that area, which the Vyanjana takes you to, and of course you participate in that. Vyanjana is not created of its own. It comes into being only on your interaction, on the reader's interaction with the poem. So then the Vyanjana takes a form, and then it leads you to an uncertain, regions where you end up having some kind of self-awareness, a feeling of your own self.
Um, a lot of these poems, I mean, emotions,
Yes.
since we just said self-awareness, and it incites rasa within ourselves and experience within ourselves. So, obviously, not necessarily what the poet has intended,
Yes.
I will experience, correct? So, that itself is also a very abstract
Correct.
proposition. But what I wanted to ask you is that when you were speaking about the process and the transformation from the Vyanjana into the Dwani, which I also understand is a space between the two words.
Yes.
It's like the echo, right? So there are a lot of poets who even, written poetry or explored the space between the two words in a very abstract way. Like the Zen poem, the haiku,
Yes.
they're very abstract, right? So, can we compare like a cultural, like, the Indian traditional concept of Dwani with a Zen, a haiku, just some comparative?
First thing I'll tell you that there is Vyanjana in all great poems around the world. We only were the first to theorize it. Like, for example, when there was no notion of dhwani in Western classical music, even then in Western classical music, if you know what dhwani, I mean, what the shruti is, you can hear that shruti even in the Western music. Of course, this concept developed in India, but the shruti, which is the sound between two notes, and that shruti you can hear in Western classical music too, their folk music also, or our folk music also, wherever. In the same way that dhwani, or Vyanjana for that matter, there is Vyanjana in Rilke, there is Vyanjana in, I mean, all great poets, you will have that. They may not have theorized it like that. That's all. I mean, Shakespeare is full of Vyanjana, so now, the point is that how from word you go to bhav. That's what Vyanjana is. That I say something, I say a sentence, and then I finally, there is a certain Vyanjana, and Vyanjana unfolds, and you experience that, right? Abhinav Gupta would say, I mean, he took an idea from the Vaiyakarans, from grammarians. And one of the traditions of grammarians, they believe that the meaning lies in us, in the reader. And word goes and evokes that meaning. Now, Rasa Siddhant believes, the idea of Rasa is precisely this, that you have emotions in you. Each one, when we pass through the life, different kind of emotion, different kind of emotive reactions that we have in us. Millions. That you have different kinds of angers, you have different kinds of loves, you have different kind of, wonder, sense of wonder. You have different kinds of griefs, and there are millions. Every day you have millions of such emotions, right? Now, what happens is that they are in all of us. But they are very personal. They are our anger. They are our griefs. They are our, sense of comic. They are our, wonders. But they also have a universal dimension to that because they are anger themselves also. They are grief themselves also. So what poem does is, through this power of Vyanjana, that it normally when you imagine your bhavas, your emotions, you imagine them or you feel them as your emotions. Right. So they, in a sense, segregate you from the world. Because you say that this is my anger, this is my pleasure, this is my this. Now, if by some means the universal dimension of your emotion is foregrounded, then immediately what happens that your anger becomes anger itself. Your love becomes love itself. You start experiencing your anger as anger itself, your sense of wonder as wonder itself. This is the point when you feel that this thing, this sense of wonder, which is universal, is present in everyone. So this is also the point when you feel you get rid of your individual ego, your individual self, and you start participating into the universal. And that is a very beautiful word that Abhinav Gupta uses there. And he says, this is the time, this is the duration of aparimit pramatritva. He says that this is in this duration, the reader feels that she has become limitless witness, or she has a limitless knowledge. And how will that be possible? It becomes only possible when she becomes everybody. And this can become only possible when she stops remaining herself. So herself gets included into this, experience of universal at that point. In fact, Kabir wrote a poem for that. And people normally pose Kabir against Sanskrit tradition. This is absolute nonsense. There's one tradition in India, and Kabir says at one point, Hum hai sabma, I'm in everybody. Sab hai hamma, everybody is in me. Hum hai bahuri akela, I'm multiply alone. Sab hoke, I'm all alone. Now this actually is describing the experience, the process of experience of the rasa. This is rasa swadan. And just see, is completely abstract. Because you yourself has become non-concrete at that moment. It has taken you through that point where you become not yourself. So that Vyanjana is capable of doing. All great poems of the world, they succeed in doing that. And in that sense, once again, the rasa word has come from kitchen, Right. And what is this? What is the similarity? The similarity is this, that when you mix 2-3 things, something else comes. So, for example, if you're making halwa, halwa's taste is not sum total of the taste of the flour, sugar, and the ghee, or whatever, right? It's not sum total of this. It is something else. Now, so you bring words together in a way that the bhav or the meaning that comes out of it, which is called pratyaman arth, it's not the arth that you can put your finger on, it's a pratyaman. It's an apparent meaning. That meaning becomes such, which is not sum total of these words. It's something else. Now this something else then allows you to experience the rasa and universal of which you are a part. So you start experience, because each one of us is a part of universe, It is universal, this whole idea of the... So that point also is a point where there is no identity question. You don't ask this question then, who am I? Because this I has disappeared already. Like it disappears every day when you dream or when you sleep. This is a very interesting exercise that somebody should go on telling oneself that, I'm going to sleep, I'm going to sleep. One would never sleep. You sleep only at the point when you forget that you are sleeping. Same happens with the rasa. You have to give yourself to a poem like a poet gives herself, to a poem and allows it to express itself. Now, that is how it is, broadly.
I'm sure people would like to hear some of your poems.
In fact,
if you could.
I have a Bengali translation I'd come for to give it to a person who was to come here.
Okay.
I don't know, Anandita was I don't know, she hasn't come for it. But I have I can't read Bengali, so somebody can read. Can you read, Tita?
বৃদ্ধ সে অন্ধকার ঘরে বসে বসে হঠাৎ ফুঁপিয়ে ওঠে। সেখানে কেউ থাকে না যে ঠিক সময় মতো তাকে সামলাবে। তার চোখের জল নিঃশব্দ টেবিলের ওপর শিশিরের মতো চুপচাপ ঝরতে থাকে। কেউ শোনে না তার ফোঁপানোর আওয়াজ, কিন্তু আওয়াজ নিশ্চয়ই হয়। অন্ধকারে চিৎকারের মতো অনবরত মিলিয়ে যাওয়া আওয়াজ। তারপর ঈশ্বর আকাশের জানালা খুলে ঝুঁকে বাইরে দেখে, আর বিস্মৃত নিজের মায়া যে এমন তা দেখে কাঁদতে শুরু করে। আমাকে একবার এক মাঝি বলেছিল, শিশির হলো পৃথিবীর ওপর ঈশ্বরের অশ্রুর ঝর্ণা, যা কখনো আটকে থাকে আর কখনো ঘাসের ডগায় চমকায়।
সে আকাশের কোনো এক কোণে গুটিসুটি মেরে দাঁড়িয়ে আছে। গভীর হাওয়া সরোবরের ওপর তার ছায়া ছড়িয়ে আছে। নৌকোর পালে ছেড়ে যাওয়া প্রজাপতির পাখায় সন্ধ্যার শেষ বিন্দু আটকে আছে। রাতের চাদর ঠোঁটে চেপে সাদা পাখিরা চারিদিকে ছড়িয়ে পড়েছে, রেখার মতো যেন কিছু বলতে চাইছে। সে কোথাও দৃশ্যমান না হয়েও প্রত্যেক জায়গায় যেন তাকে দেখা যাচ্ছে।
So I'm sure even the language has its own character, its own limitation, its own. So when these poems are translated, I know I'm just deviating a little, but what does a translator has to then capture? The rhythm, or the vyanjana, the rhythm?
It's very difficult, it's very difficult. Once I wrote an essay on translation because I translated some poems of my French poet friend. In fact, he's my translator, so he's translated lots of my poems, but he's a very good poet himself. So I was thinking that what am I translating? That I came to realize that actually I'm translating his accent. Because there is a certain accent of the poem. I'm not talking about the accent of the poet. They are very different things. What I was trying to say that inherent, that sleeping rhythm or music within each one of us, that gets manifested in a poem. Now, if you are able to find it somehow, and you can find it only intuitively, you cannot, it's not something it's on the surface. It's like purloined letter. It's there on the surface. If you are capable of seeing it, and if you don't fall into this trap of meaning dictionaries, of course they are necessary, but they have to be left behind. So what you in the end attempt to find is that accent, which means lots of things, like accent of a poem. And when this accent of the poem is found in a translation, while you are translating, then of course, then you translate it well. Now, when my poems are translated, I normally show it to people who know only one language. For example, I showed them to somebody who knew only Bengali. Because I don't want this poem to be true to my poem. I want this poem to be true to itself. If it can stand of its own, it's wonderful. Because, as I told you, that very process that I understand of writing a poem, I cannot claim to own a poem. My name is only the address of the poem. If I start owning the poem, of course, that doesn't mean that editors should stop giving me money when they publish. Of course, you have to pay for the address also. So I'm not saying that. And therefore, a poem should stand of its own. Like my poems in French translations, I never tried to decode it. I knew people who knew Hindi very well, who knew French very well, and they were my very close friends. But I never told them I only showed them that how do they read in French? Do they stand of their own? If they can, it's wonderful. Because this whole idea of owning, a poem, or for that matter, even an idea. A filmmaker that I love a lot, it's called Bresson. He's a French filmmaker. And he said that ideas have their own movement. They have their own life. So you are just coincidentally you were there. Patang jab kati tab aapki chhat khali thi. But that's all, no? I mean, nahi hoti to kahin aur chal. So you cannot claim that. So
The apple just fell on Einstein.
Einstein, Newton. It might have fell on Einstein also.
So I just had an observation. So paintings don't get translated, music
Yes.
doesn't get
Yes,
translated,
yes.
but poems get translated.
And in fact, that's a very, very interesting problem. And that's why from translation, you should stand 4-5 feet away from that. That's the best. And I think you cannot translate. I mean, this whole argument that the poems cannot be translated at all, etc. This is the first sentence. The poems cannot be translated. True. But you can create the resonance of one poem in different languages. That is what we call translation.
So now coming to your practice and your poems, you're very, you've studied under Manikol, your family is very culturally sound and you've been exposed to all arts, right? And how has that impacted, influenced your own poetry, your own writing, your own process?
It's not only true for me, it's true for lots of poets, and lots of artists world over. There's a small story which I think most of the people might be knowing, but there's nothing wrong in repeating because at least there will be one who would not know that story. So there's a story. There's a story is in Vishnu Dharmottar Puran. It's a very old story, a great story, I think. And it's called, so there was a king called Vajra, and his teacher was Markandeya. So King Vajra asked Markandeya, that I want happiness in the life. So he said, you can get happiness if you make a good sculpture, Deva Pratima. And Dev actually means two things, Dev also means ancestor, Prachin. So Pratima, the sculpture. So he said, yes, tell me how a sculpture is done. So Markandeya says that, replies that I'll teach you that how a sculpture is made only when you know how a painting is done. Because that person who knows how to do the painting will be capable of making a sculpture. So he said, okay, then tell me how a painting is done. So he said, I'll tell you how a painting is done, but for that, you must know how the dance is done. So he said, okay, teach me dance. So he says that of course, will teach you dance, but before that, you must know how instrumental music is done. So from instrumental music, and he says that, okay, start with instrumental music. He said, for that you must know how the vocal music is done. So he said, okay, vocal music. For that, he said, you must know how poetry is done. So poem. And then, of course, he comes up to grammar. So he starts teaching from there and goes up to sculpture. Now, this sequence need not be the same every time. For a poet, the top, that means sculpture, is poetry. So he or she will have to learn these to finally do this, to write a poem. In fact, if you read Kalidas carefully, you would know that Kalidas knows all art forms very, very deeply. And only then he is able, in fact, once Kelu Charan Mahapatra, this very great dancer, he told me that, he said, because they do Geet Govindam a lot. So he said, what I am doing as a dance in Geet Govind is already there in Geet Govind. I am only bringing it on my body, which means he believed that the dance was already included, was inherent in a written text. In the same way, all these arts are contained in each other. I'm not talking about relationship of the arts. In fact, a poem is always already a dance. It's always already a music, is always already painting, always already a sculpture, etc., And the same is true with other forms also. So, and in India, they used to call it Kavi Siksha. That there has to be proper, siksha proper education, for a poet. Now, because we don't have institutions like that, and if you write poetry, and if you feel that that is your vocation, your dharma, then this hard work needs to be done. And I was fortunate that I could do it, because there was Bharat Bhavan, the house I was living in, and I got my teachers, and, I could find Nirmal Verma there. And, lots of my friends also, my teachers, they were there. But I think for every poet, for every dancer, for every musician, all that is, I think, is very necessary. For film or theater, I think this absolutely must. But for everything else also, it's necessary.
So I'm sure we would like to hear at least one poem. If you don't have it, okay. So should we open it to the audience? I mean, Ashokji, if you want to comment, say something. Geeti Sen.
We spoke about rhythm, and I just wanted to remind ourselves that this morning I was reading a book here in the library on Abanindranath Tagore. Abanindranath Tagore also wrote as well as painted. And some years I learned today, he stopped painting. He started painting quite late, early, but he stopped for 8 years, 1930 to 38. He wrote this book called The Canons of Indian Art, the 6 canons which we already know. But he added one. That canon is something that I'd like you to comment on, Udayanji. It's very similar to, but the idea in Bengali, and here we come to the idea of different languages again, the word he uses is chanda. And he says chanda is another canon, adding it to the 6 canons, and adding chanda as a very necessary canon. Now, chanda, does it mean the same? Would it translate into rhythm, or would it mean something else?
Chand word comes from Vedas, actually, and it means covering, avaran. It's a covering, as cover, to cover. And it goes with chal. It's called chal chand. That's used. Chal chand. So, another connotation of that word chand also is that it's some kind of temporality. What you say is some kind of temporality. Now, if that temporality, if you can calculate it, if you can measure it, then it's called meter. But in Natyashastra, with Bharat, he says that there can be, the shloka is that there cannot be a chand without a word, and there cannot be a word without chand. So even if you are writing whatever rhythm is there, whether it's a iambic pentameter or it's a prose poem, there will always be a chand, and which means that there will always be a certain rhythm to that. Whether that rhythm is measurable or not, you experience that rhythm. This is the first meaning of chand. Now there's another meaning also of the chand, which is, of course, I thought about it like that, which I call micro chand or sukshma chand. It is that when you hear a poem, and when you get its bhav, the emotional content of that, of sentence, of few sentences, there will always be a delay in between. There will always be a certain time in between that you hear the word and then a certain bhav is evoked in you. There will always be a delay. And this delay in different poems will have different forms. And that is actually the sukshma micro chand, It's a sukshma chand. That too is a chand. And, and through Vyanjana that happens, when you are Vyanjana is there in a poem, that it always takes some time for you, in you, for that unfolding of the bhavas. That when it reaches that bhava, a certain bhava is evoked. There's a certain time to it, and that too is a chant. You know? Pita. पिता देर रात दरवाजे पर खड़े हैं, मैं नींद में चलता दरवाज़ा खोलता हूँ, पीछे कहीं माँ के होने की सरसराहट है, उसके भी पीछे बादलों की ओट में वह तितर बितर धागों की तरह फैली है। वे मेरे सिर पर वैसे ही हाथ फेरते हैं जैसे मरने के पहले फेरते थे। मैं उन्हें देख रो पड़ता हूँ, काका मैं तुम्हें तब भी नहीं बचा पाया, और अब अपनी इन ढेरों कविताओं में भी मैं हर बार उसी तरह विफल हो जाता हूँ। कहीं दूर से माँ की सरसराहट मेरे बहुत करीब आती है और मेरी आत्मा पर छाया की तरह फैलने लगती है। And in this whole book there's lots of, because I lost my father, mother, and very early. So maybe the whole lifetime struggle to give new body to them. This is called Ganit. Count. पिता की बीमारी में माँ की दोस्त पास के कमरे में आके बैठती हैं। पिता के कमरे में केवल माँ का जाना होता है। उनके लौटने पर वे दोस्त चुपचाप माँ की आंखों में झांकती हैं। नानी अस्पताल के कमरे में झुककर अपने टेढ़े हाथों से अपने भाई की जेब से तमाकू निकालने की कोशिश करती है। मैं कोने की कुर्सी पर बैठा पिता के खुले पेट पर लहराती सांसों को गिनने में लगा हूँ, यह जाने बगैर कि जीवन अभी हाल पिता के गणित को सुलझा कर जा चुका है। अब सिर्फ मौत का आना बाकी है, जिसकी सब डॉक्टर मानकर प्रतीक्षा कर रहे हैं।
We have a concept where there is the beauty or the lure of the unexpected. Now, this lure of the unexpected, how does it sort of manifest itself in chand or in abstraction?
How do you connect one sentence or one image in a poem to the other? Let's say, if you have connected image A to suddenly image I, so that suddenly comes something which was never expected, and by bringing them together, and of course this is not mechanical, it has to come in a certain rhythm, it has to come as a part of a certain music. When it comes, then it's very lucidly coming, and yet you feel there's the same lay, and suddenly something new is happening. This is one. Number two, that what I'm calling rhythm is a multiple thing in a poem. It's not like music that in fact in music is also not like that. Even if somebody is singing, let's say in teen tal, there will be sometimes dugun, the speed will be doubled, and sometimes it will be chogun, same tal. Now, in poetry also, the rhythm can be, there can be slow rhythm, but by the same scale, the rhythm can be multiplied. So that also, through rhythm also, you can create an unexpected, because suddenly one sentence comes at, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the other sentence comes 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, components are same, but you have multiplied it and you have hastened it. So what happens in that, like in music, that you expend the time and then you shrunk, you bring the time together, you shrunk it. You're shrinking it and then expanding it. And between this shrinking and expanding, there will also be a third rhythm will come into play. What I'm trying to say is there are various layers of the rhythm which are which are at work when you are reading a poem carefully. And that, to perceive it like that, you need a very high degree of attention. And of course, poem also evokes that attention to you. Like, when you see a beautiful scenery, for example, poem is not a beautiful scenery anyway, but the attention suddenly becomes very deep. You go on, seeing it, or if you're listening to some beautiful sound of a bird or something, then the depth of the attention is very important in that awareness. If your attention is not deep enough, then that poem already has lost all those characteristics. All those elements will be nowhere.
This discussion of dhani, etc. I recall this Avilashitartha Chintamani, which says, Rangina vidyate chitram, tattami akshara bharjitam. So this evocation of that untranslatable, evocation of the untranslatable in concrete terms, abstraction of the quintessential rhythm. And I was looking at Raza painting also, and I was talking about, this movement from the architectonic to the tectonic, and his hermeneutic journey when from Gorbio to Mandla to back. And this evocation of the untranslatable in terms of rhythm, which is also bound by certain norms and rules. Is that possible? I mean, is abstraction at all abstractable? That is the question.
Untranslatable, and you are trying to say it through something like words or very concrete rhythm, and through that you are saying something which is untranslatable. In fact, I think that in poetry what you do is that you are attempting to give form to the unsayable through sables. So what happens is the poem tries to, the entire Alankar Shastra to me, it's a technique to break open the language and allow that unsayable, to be experienced. So what happens is that you create a structure in the language through rhythm, through words and meanings, bringing them together, etc., in such a way that this unsayable creates cracks in the language. And through the crack, the parallel to that is the space contained within a pitcher. In Ghatakash, what they say. So the Ghatakash, the space within a pitcher, always wants to merge with the total space. So when the pitcher is broken, then actually the absence of the totality of the universal which was there in that ghat, like in all of us, there is an absence of the universal in us. That's a great absence, as the Suresh Sharma used to call it. So there's a great absence in us. And when you write a poem, through that, you allow that language, you create some, through mechanisms, through Alankar and Dhwani and all, so that the language gets cracked. And this unsayable, becomes experienced, And of course, the rhythms, with rhythms and togetherness of the word and the meaning, etc., they all come together for that. So in the end, language, the poetry is a very non-violent violence on language. It breaks open the language. And this Alankar Shastras, whether we are talking about Dhwani or Alankar Shastra, through Upma, Rupak, or Anyokti or whatever, what you do is that you are trying to break that picture of the language. Of course, I know I have not answered your question.
Thank you very much. It was, of course, enlightening, but indeed it was very engaging in many, many senses, not just words, as Sir said. So on that note, we'll conclude today's session, and there is a little bit tea and refreshment on the second floor. I'd request everybody to join there. Thank you very much.